Okay. Pero primero, para visitar los artículos de las diferentes pero sí, daron a entonces, bueno, pues ya podríamos la lengua y de ahí se está utilizando en otros obviamente los personajes son un poco más chicos no es de la política pero que eso es trabajar y hay más pero son neutrales sexo género de y este paso es que ya aprendí a hacer la investigación porque si iba aquí ahora ya sé cómo se hace. Si querías ir por claro, voy a hacer mucho más. De hecho, No podíamos.
Hey, y'all. I just want to call us to order here now. I have the very short task of calling us all to order and then introducing our former chair, Jerry Heckler, who will be introducing the conference coming up next year. I guess not only are you our former chair, but you're sort of our conference butcher. This is the second conference you've sort of really sort of handled logistics on and sort of identified an awesome opportunity. So without further ado, there.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to be brief. It's just been an honor to get to know the folks at the University of Rutgers Camden in the Department of Public Policy Administration. And I just operate, my official title for the conference is just primary conference, because it really is about being this bridge, which is an apt metaphor for how the conference is going to look next year. Camden itself, if you're not familiar with it, is in New Jersey, underneath the Ben Franklin Bridge. And it really, this conference, the Bay Bridge links Camden to basically the Liberty Bell, right, in Philadelphia. So the birthplace of the American experiment, or the United Statesian experiment. And Camden, the University of Rutgers Camden Department of Public Policy and Administration serves as this bridge with the community. Community engagement is really, as I've learned about the department, I've come to learn that community engagement is central to everything they do. So the conference is going to be held, the actual panel sessions are going to be in local nonprofit organizations. A community that has been just ripped apart by a lot, has shown tremendous resilience. And the organizations that have shown this resilience are often Black-owned, and in these urban neighborhoods that can sometimes get subject to gentrification and white flight at the same time, right? And so we're going to be going to La Unique African-American Bookstore and Cultural Center. We'll host some of the sessions. Another one will be the Idea Center for the Arts, which is brilliant space that introduces young people and community residents to the arts. And we're using a Black-owned business to supply the coffee. It's going to be a really interesting and wonderful event. I hope to see you all there. And so now that I've pumped our conference for next year, where I hope to all see you, I'd like to introduce the director, the department chair of the Department of Public Policy and Administration, Dr. Patrice Marshall. She'll introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Larry. I am so happy to be hosting the conference next year in Camden, and I hope to see all of you there. And today I am also happy to be introducing the moderator for our plenary that we at Rutgers Camden are sponsoring, Jennifer Martinez-Medina of Portland State University. Her work focuses on the increasing globalization and free market policies and the impact that that has on expressions of community, citizenship, and participation. The panel today is going to focus on a COVID Farmworkers study. And this is really critical to what we do in this organization, public administration theory, because the Farmworkers movement arose out of a history of racial injustice in employment and migration. It's rooted in labor rights as human rights, and also has links to the civil rights movement. And so for those of us who study the workers' movement and workers' rights, we often use this phrase, bread and roses, this idea that we want for people to have good quality jobs, work with dignity, and we also want them to have a good life outside of work. So there's the bread and there's the roses, and that is going to be covered in today's panel. So thank you very much.
For that introduction, I'd like to invite our panelists today up to the stage. So as they get settled in, let me just make some quick remarks. Good afternoon. As you heard, my name is Jennifer Martinez-Medina. My pronouns are she, her, ella. I just finished my PhD program here. I want to welcome you all to the Pacific Northwest, especially if this is your first time. You got the rain, so you got the full treatment. I hope you're enjoying the conference, and I hope you don't fall asleep. That pasta comes with coffee and dessert so that you can stay up. So as you heard, I'm going to serve as today's facilitator for the session. I've invited several of my colleagues who are really good friends, and I've been working with them for over 3 years. And even though we've been working closely together since the pandemic initiated, this is the first time I've met some of them in person. So, we could really talk about how the pandemic has changed, research and our work together. So, as you heard, we're going to talk about the Oregon COVID-19 Farmworker study, and before the end of today, you'll know all about it. But to begin this plenary session, I'm going to set the context briefly by just telling you a little bit about the project, this community engaged effort and how it initiated, and how it really relates to the greater conference theme of the great renewal of theory, praxis, and pedagogy. So my colleagues are going to present a collective of community, well, my colleagues here are a collective of community organizations, researchers, promotoras, and community educators who were all involved in Oregon cause and were critical in responding to the pandemic, especially farm worker needs throughout these past several years. And so the heart of our discussion will center on my colleagues taking turns answering 5 questions. So we'll pose 5 different discussion questions. They'll take turns answering those, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for Q&A afterwards. And just a quick note on language. Some of my colleagues are most comfortable speaking Spanish, so I'm going to do a little translation here and there. So there'll be a little extra time for that. But before I go any further and give you some context, I just wanted to do a brief round of introduction. I wanted to ask my colleagues to go around, give their name, pronouns, affiliation, title, and their role in Oregon cause.
Good afternoon. My name is Valentin Sanchez. I'm a senior paralegal with the Oregon Law Center, which is a nonprofit private law firm that provides free civil legal services. So my primary job at the Oregon Law Center is doing community engagement with farmworkers, and have been involved with this research since the beginning. Connecting with farmworkers, conducting interviews, and analyzing the data. I'm happy to be here.
Hi, everyone. My name is Laurie, Hoefer, and I'm the Farmworker Program Director with Legal Aid Services of Oregon. My pronouns are she, her, ella. And Legal Aid Services, the team in our organization that includes not just myself, but a long-term community outreach worker, Ana Weller, who has spent 43 years serving the agricultural worker community, and Olga Bautista, and we participated in helping to think about what kinds of questions to include in the survey, and then built upon kind of relationships that have been developed for decades to identify those communities and participants who might be willing to participate in the survey, as well as coming together with this wonderful group of people to think about what their statements mean.
Good morning. My name is Gabriela Pérez. I am an associate professor in linguistics at the University of Oregon. It wasn't very clear to me how a linguist could contribute to this study at the beginning, but I was generously invited by my colleague Lynn, who will get to me in a second. But what was really important is that to come to realize that the farm workers do not constitute a monolithic community, but in fact, this community is made up of a great diversity of cultures, languages, people from a number of different communities, people of urban, but also indigenous origin, and that meant we needed to understand their linguistic rights needs in order to be able to address a number of questions that we were interested in this study. So that my contribution was in trying to identify the languages with as much accuracy as possible that were represented in this community of farmworkers.
Lynn Steuben, I'm a professor of anthropology at the University of Oregon. I've been doing work on Mesoamerican indigenous communities and diasporas. I've done a lot of work in Mexico and Guatemala. I do a lot of expert witnessing for asylum cases. And I knew a couple of people in this project before it started, but it's been amazing participating, collectively creating a research design, research questions. I did interviewing and did analysis together, and we did writing together. So it's great to see you all, and I look forward to our conversation.
Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Sandra Martín. Good afternoon, my name is Sandra Martín. Yo trabajo para la organización de bienestar. I work for the organization Bienestar. Trabajo como servicio al residente y a la comunidad. I work as service to residents and community. Para mí este proyecto fue uno de los principales pioneros a empezar para trabajar y trabajar con los y entrevistas a trabajadores agrícolas ha sido muy importante y me ha abierto mucho camino para poder ayudar a la comunidad. For me, this project was the first time working with community and learning more about their needs and being able to service the community.
Orgullosa de trabajar con estos colegas que por primera vez nos estamos viendo en persona. Hemos trabajado por 3 años por Zoom y para mí es un honor estar con ellos y aprendiendo mucho de ellos. Gracias.
It's an honor to be here with my colleagues who I've been working with for over 3 years and on many occasions we met for the first time. And I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Hello, everyone. Jorge Alvarado with the HTC, Farmworker Housing Development Corporation in Woodburn. We are a affordable housing nonprofit, and we do affordable housing for families in rural areas. Silverton, Salem, Woodburn, Alvarado would be our next project. Pronouns, he and they. Just happy to be here. I'm probably one of the newest members in the group, but I'm glad that I get invited to be there with you guys today.
Thank you so much. So yeah, this is really excited again to be here. Thank you so much for the space, Brad, Sam, Billy for inviting us here. As I mentioned, I'm just going to give you some quick context. I realize I don't have a clicker, so I'll walk down to my computer to switch the slides periodically. But as you may or may not know, Oregon is home to nearly 200,000 migrant and seasonal farm workers and their family members who support a multi-billion-dollar industry here in the state. On March 19, 2020, farm workers were labeled essential and were asked to continue working as much of the general public was directed to quarantine at home. And during this time, there was a lot of uncertainty around the risk of COVID-19, especially lack of clarity about how people could best protect themselves. And this was the same case for farm workers in protecting their families. Information changed rapidly. However, many of us with years of experience working with these communities and being part of the communities themselves knew that farm workers were going to be vulnerable to the pandemic's broad impacts. And this was their economic impacts, health impacts, access to resources, access to information, and in general, all these intersections in order for them to maintain their well-being, right, and their families' well-being. And by April 3rd, 2020, a collective of researchers and community organizations and advocates began meeting about the unraveling pandemic and its impacts on farm workers and their families. And the massive outreach effort was led by the California Institute for Rural Studies, or CIRS, and it's an independent research institute established back in 1977 by the late Dr. John Villarejo. The institute was established, or has an established track record of working with farm worker serving organizations on different research for action projects, such as the Agricultural Workers Health Study, analyzing the well-being of indigenous farm worker communities. We've written various white papers and policy papers on farm labor contractors and safety in the fields, how to get accurate counts of farm workers, pesticides regulation, and many other topics. And so CRS coordinated this effort by launching weekly meetings that would eventually create and culminate into the COVID-19 farm worker study in California. And so contacts here in Oregon, including me and my colleagues here, also initiated their own efforts here in Oregon and in Washington. And so we followed the same cost model that centered community organizations through all aspects of the research process, as we've heard. And the organizations that came to serve on this effort, have a long track record of serving farm worker communities on different issues. So some community organizations worked on housing, others worked on workplace enforcement, legal rights, building leadership, organizing capacity. And so these different perspectives were really critical in this whole co-creation of the study. We also worked with researchers at U of O, OSU, and PSU, including doctoral candidates and graduate students. And what we decided to do was launch a 2-phase study. In the first phase, we surveyed 300 farm workers across the state. And in the second phase, we followed up with in-depth discussions with 48 farm workers. And we published these reports or results in 2 different studies. And community organizations, particularly the promotores, promotoras, or outreach educators, met weekly with us to develop each phase of the project, including the questions, the design, and we established training together. And so with the leadership of community organizations, we also developed a resource list so that interviewers could connect farm workers directly to resources. So in this way, our research was a continuous conversation. Farm workers were also receiving support and connecting with community organizations to be able to navigate the pandemic. And we continue to meet throughout the data collection process, which really allowed for sense making and exchange of knowledge from 4 important perspectives: farm workers themselves, promotoras, community organizations, and researchers. And this method of theory building led to the first comprehensive grasp of the diversity of Oregon farm workers, as you'll hear today, including the increasing number of campesinas or farm worker women in the fields, and and the gender impacts that were exacerbated by the pandemic. But we also were able to document the rich and ethnic linguistic diversity of farm workers and found that they speak over 29 distinct Mesoamerican languages. And this was really different from some of the core findings from the National Agricultural Worker Survey that is conducted annually. So we were finding that our farm workers here in Oregon were different from those results. And so we worked collectively together to put this research into action based on the collective's policy recommendations. And we held press conferences to disseminate our findings, policy brief with Oregon legislators. We held several presentations with relevant state agencies and community networks. And with the help of U of O, we also discussed our findings with former U.S. Secretary of Labor, Marty Walsh. Then in the summer of 2021, we held the first ever Mesoamerican language conference in Oregon, where we invited Indigenous leaders to present the best practices to improve linguistic accessibility. Over 200 public administrators, public servants, and community organizations attended. Since then, we presented in various conferences, provided testimony, published op-eds, and the Bank of Information has inspired and supported important policy work, such as farm worker overtime and the legislation to improve language accessibility for Mesoamerican languages. That's if legislators return to work here in Oregon. Then in 2022, we turned our attention to disseminating the information back to farm worker communities. We published a limited podcast called Voces en Campo that featured the voices of promotoras and also farm workers. This was organized around our main findings. And so the podcast became available through community radio airways and online. We also held an in-person event in the spring to once again connect farm workers to resources and community organizations. And for example, you'll hear Sandra, and she created one podcast story called Mujer Campesina. So she might talk about that, to talk a little bit about the intersections of some of these results. So just to end and turn it over to my colleagues, when many of us began this project, we didn't imagine how significant this fountain of information we co-created would be in deepening our understanding of what we already knew about farm workers. But it was really this critical process of knowledge creation that really supported this project. And so here we are reflecting 3 years later. So as you listen today, we want you to consider the following question: how can public administration respect the rich knowledge systems farm workers and immigrant communities contribute to various political arenas? So with that, I'm going to dive right in, asking my colleagues these 5 different questions. And so the first question is, how did farm workers make sense of the pandemic? In particular, how did they access COVID-19 information and resources to best protect themselves and their families? I'm going to say it in Spanish. ¿Cómo entendieron los trabajadores agrícolas la pandemia? En particular, ¿cómo accedieron la información y los recursos de COVID-19 para protegerse mejor?
Thank you, Jenny. Again, Valentin Sanchez. I've been working with the Oregon Law Center since 2002, so over 20 years of community engagement with farm workers providing critical information to farm workers and their family members throughout the state through different venues, outreach, visiting employer provided labor housing, radio shows, interviews, parent meetings, and so forth. And so having that connection with the community really helped me understand kind of the issues that they were already experiencing for the pandemic, including the lack of adequate employment protection, lack of heat stress protection, lack of wildfire smoke protection, and so many other laws that are not aligning with the reality in the workplace. And so when we learned about the COVID-19 pandemic, our team, which includes staff attorneys, it includes our Farmworker program director, who has been with the organization and its predecessor for over 40 years, we knew that it was going to impact our client community, our farmer population. And so the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated everything. And your farmworkers had the lack of adequate information. There was a lot of misinformation, disinformation that were readily available through social media. And so we also had, recommendation from our public health department. And, the reality in the workplace really made it challenging for farm workers to follow those recommendations because, in the workplace, there's the power dynamic. Employers are responsible to provide field sanitation. But we heard of stories where farm workers do not have sufficient water to wash their hands frequently before, after eating. We also heard of instances where workers were being encouraged to work in groups. And so physical distancing was impossible. And I mean, a lot of the farm workers that we talked to were afraid of retaliation, losing their job, losing their housing. And so there was this kind of lack of control over their own health and safety in the workplace. And so that really created a huge challenge. We also, talked to many workers who face or saw many outbreaks in the workplace. And so, early during the onset of the pandemic, a lot of farm workers were being blamed for the outbreaks when in reality, it was out of their control. But luckily, Oregon Health Authority did an amazing job recognizing those lack of adequate protections in the workplace, the lack of information. And so they developed a pretty strong relationship with community-based organizations, developing culturally and linguistically appropriate educational materials that were being disseminated by the same community-based organizations. These are organizations that have been working for a really long time and have established trust with the communities that they work with. And so I think that approach made a significant difference about how people can protect themselves, access resources, about the importance of vaccine, and many other resources that were becoming available. But I would say that at the beginning of the pandemic, it was a huge impact on our farm worker community, and it still is today. I think that our system is not yet designed to be able to serve and protect farm workers, but I think that with information that we have gathered from our interviews, with the farmer population, hopefully that will elucidate these experiences, not only in the workplace, but also living conditions so that we can make positive changes and improve the lives of, farm worker, including their family members.
Thank you, Valentin. I'll pose that same question to our colleague Jorge.
Well, for our community, Whitburn, one of the biggest challenges that we had was helping families understand the process of sending loved ones back. And while the process was very difficult, there was also families in charge from outside sources to help them with the process. And so families were paying from $300 to $500 just to get basic information on what it takes to send their loved ones back. And so for us, connecting our families with the Mexicano or the Mexican Council of Employment was an essential partnership. we helped, our families understand what the process was, and also giving financial resources from the government, from the Mexican government as well. We have the opportunity to bring the Mexican consulate to Woodburn into our site to help families coordinate the process and to get better. And it's sending loved ones back to Mexico. Sometimes it took them 5 months before they were able to send it back. And so it was not just the grieving process was also another challenge. Connecting our farm workers to counseling services. Again, it's our community. It's very vulnerable. A lot of the information that they get is based from word of mouth. It's not so much from flyers or television. It's mostly like, hey, come see my friend. My friend was able to get this information from this friend. And so that's how the miscommunication starts. And that's how people begin to take advantage of our community. When I say our community, I mean our farm worker community, because that's the community.
Yeah, is the address that is in the system for me is 520 South 7th Street, DeKalb.
Now I'll pass it over to Sandra. And I'll do some interpretation here. Some of the challenges in the beginning was because the information didn't reach farm workers in the languages they speak.
Esa fue una de las carreras principales que todavía no tuvieron porque al principio pues ellos no sabían lo que estaba pasando, el cuidado que tenían que tener por la barrera del idioma.
That was a major challenge because people weren't able to know what was happening and what resources they had access to because of the barrier of information. Gracias. So then I'm going to go on to the second question we have for today's panel discussion. What are the ongoing barriers farm workers face? Elaborate on any intersections such as workplace conditions, immigration status, gender, and language. And for this question, I'm going to call my colleague Gabriela to talk a little bit about that.
Yes, thank you. Jenny, should we show some of the slides with the language? Maybe the map we can start with that. So thank you for the opportunity to respond to this question. I think that, one of the points through which we can start addressing this question is the fact that at an international level, we talk about sustainable development goals that include decent work, quality education, health and well-being, among many other goals. And in this particular case, in the United States, in a highly developed country, it was impossible to fulfill these basic goals because there was no understanding of the languages used among farm workers in this particular case in the context of Oregon farm workers during the COVID pandemic. Because these farm workers come primarily from Mexico and Guatemala, they are assumed to be Spanish speakers and they are assumed to be literate. But these are also regions that, first of all, are highly linguistically diverse. In Mexico alone, there's well over 300 languages. There are so many languages in these regions that even as linguists do not agree on a number. We continually identify and reorganize the classification of the languages that we know, and there's many languages we don't know yet. So that's the number one thing. Number two, despite the fact that in places like Mexico, Guatemala, there are laws that protect bilingual, bicultural education, the reality is that in very few places is this being actually implemented, and there's a tremendous lack of resources for bilingual, bicultural education that allows, for instance, for literacy in the indigenous local languages. So when we extrapolate and come to the Oregon farm working setting, we can, assuming that farm workers from Mexico and Guatemala are literate and Spanish speakers, it's already a tremendous misstep. We are, in fact, addressing a community that speaks any number of languages. In the COPS project, 300 farm workers were interviewed, and out of that relatively small population, we found 29 distinct languages. In the map, you can see where the languages are spoken indigenously in Mexico and in Guatemala. And if we go to a couple of the other slides, thank you. So you can see here 4 different Mayan languages. It is very common to hear someone say, well, we need an interpreter of Mayan. And then the immediate question is, well, which Mayan language? Because there's well over 30 Mayan languages. And even Mam that you see there, we identified 3 distinct Mam varieties. If you ask the now fallecida, sorry, I forgot the word in English, the expert in Mayan languages, Nora England, has passed away recently. But even she would consider Mam to be one single language. But when it comes to interpreting and ensuring that someone will be interpreted in a way that is fully intelligible to the person who's requiring the interpretation, we need to identify which Mam variety from which region the person is from. Let's maybe take a look at one more. So here we have, I think, 7 or so Nahuatl languages. We also know Nahuatl because that is the language that was spoken by the Aztecs. So, but we hear the notion of classical Nahuatl, one language alone, right? Or one label for a bunch of languages. There's 4 dozen Nahuatl languages, and we found 7 or 8 in this 300 population sample. And the same goes for Mixtec languages, Zapotec languages, Triqui languages, which we found in this sample. So to summarize, a key barrier is not understanding that that this is a very diverse population, and this is that population that uses language as we all began to learn language as children, orally. Written language is very secondary. It comes in when we're 5, 6, 7 years old. It takes us from K to 12 to be proficient users of written language, but language is oral or signed. We actually did not even touch on sign languages in this study. So there's already there another layer of language use that we're not understanding.
Muchas gracias, Gabriela. How about Lynn?
Great. Is there one?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, well, I want to talk a little bit about differential impacts or how obstacles work differently by gender, by age, by ethnicity, by language. And I start with this slide. This is an example. Is there one? Yeah, loss of work and reduce. Yeah. So one of the overall results was that people lost work, right? For a lot of different reasons, months and weeks. Indigenous workers, 63% of the people we surveyed lost weeks or months of work, and overall about 49%. So economic vulnerability, but that doesn't tell the whole story. How does economic vulnerability affect women differently, affect children, affect young people? Can you go to the next slide? So one of the things that was most interesting, and I'll talk more about this when we talk about sort of how did people cope in terms of mental health with the pandemic and all the restrictions, is that Indigenous women in particular reported losing months of wages. Like all women in the country, Indigenous and farm worker women stayed home more than men to take care of children during the pandemic. Okay? And in this particular population, this meant coping with schoolwork. Coping with schoolwork in English on a tablet or a device that you didn't know how to use. And many families didn't have multiple tablets. Sometimes schools brought them to them, multiple children using one cell phone. moms driving their kids to try to find a hotspot so they could, you know, access schoolwork, children not being able to, you know, play outside or meet with friends. And all of this had a very strong impact on women as caretakers that we'll, you know, that we'll talk more about, and people's mental health. On the flip side, women were also amazingly resilient. And when we talk about care and the kind of caretaking capacity that communities came up with on their own, often when they weren't accessing programs that maybe they even had a right to access. Like, how did these networks work? And all of these families are what I call, at least in my own work, transborder. They're connected many places in the US, many places in Mexico and Guatemala, right? And they're connected on a daily basis. And we'll talk a little bit more, supporting them economically, emotionally, financially. And that also was very gendered labor. So there are ways in which these obstacles work differently for women, for young people, for youth, some people who were in school, you know, they're at home, they're 16, they could work. If there was work, would they be working? So it had very different impacts for people, even underneath that, you know, very clear statistic of economic vulnerability and loss of wage.
It's so important to really focus on the youth information brokering and also the subsidy they had to do when, you know, their parents lost work. But I'll go ahead and turn it over to Laurie.
I think there's many, you know, issues that farmworkers continue to see. You know, one of them is employer-provided labor housing. In the state, we have, I would say, perhaps 400 registered labor camps. These are employer-provided housing. Some of them house anywhere between, you know, 10 up to 200, 300 farmworkers, including family members throughout the state. And, you know, some of the housing, we continue to see, you know, overcrowding as being one issue. We also, you know, the proximity of these labor camps to the orchards where pesticides are applied creates a lot of public health concerns, given that, you know, people work there, they live there, and during the summer season, you know, because many of the housing don't have AC units, you know, some you know, farmworkers will leave their windows open, you know, overnight. And some of the pesticides are applied, you know, early in the morning or, you know, late at night. And so pesticide drift and pesticide exposure is a big concern. We also know that, you know, there are many other issues such as heat stress. You know, heat stress is an issue that we have been talking about for over 10 years. Luckily, we now have new, you know, heat stress protection for farm workers and also for wildfire smoke. And I think that the other, you know, biggest issue would say, you know, we need to increase enforcement. We have pretty good laws right now. We just need, you know, better enforcement by our state agencies to ensure that employers are following you know, these obligations to protect their workers in the workplace. And hopefully we are moving towards that direction. Hopefully we're moving towards a direction where we can make systemic positive changes to improve employer-provided housing so that farm workers and their family members can live in a more humane way. I also want to credit, you know, we have some employer labor housing that are in great condition. They're just, you know, amazing. You know, some of them have installation, but the vast majority, you know, are not in that condition where it will protect farm workers and their family members.
Thank you, Valentin. So not only having the laws, but also the enforcement behind the laws is so important and critical.
I guess I can just mention briefly to add on to what Valentin is saying, that I think the conversations with agricultural workers really showed us how these intersections of their kind of living and work conditions impacted their decisions about accessing healthcare and other decisions related to the pandemic. And it's not just regarding their ability to access information about kind of COVID protections, but also workplace protections. In the survey, 54% of those who were surveyed said that they didn't even know about some of the basic sick leave protections in the workplace. But I think not just in regards to their knowledge or lack of knowledge of workplace rights, the other key piece of it is that their dependence on the income from their job and their kind of inability to access those workplace protections because of their fear of retaliation absolutely impacted their risk assessment and their decisions. And so we saw that some workers, made decisions not to be tested, not to seek care, to go to work because of their economic reality. They actually had a perceived risk and a reasonable perceived risk of losing their income that is greater than what they would suffer from COVID or exposure to COVID. And that lack of income support and that continued fear of retaliation continues. So I think those are some of the structures that we need to continue to think about.
Thank you. Quiero agregar algo de lo que mis compañeros han hablado. Una de las barreras tan grandes que tuvieron los trabajadores agrícolas es cuando empezaron a dar positivo con el COVID.
One of the additional contributions I want to say is one of the biggest barriers was when farm workers were starting to test positive for COVID.
Muchos de ellos viven en apartamentos, tienen familias numerosas y no tenían cómo ellos quedarse aislados y ya no estar en contacto con el resto de la familia.
Many of them live in apartments and share their household with different members and didn't have anywhere to quarantine when they were sick.
Eso fue uno de los desafíos tan grandes que ellos tuvieron en muchas de las encuestas que estuvimos haciendo, fueron por lo que resaltaba también esa parte para ellos, el miedo, el temor de contagiar a familias y que toda la familia se contagiara y qué iban a hacer ellos.
This was a major theme in the study and findings, was the fear farm workers felt when they were sick and worried that they would get their family members sick and weren't sure what to do because they didn't have this point.
En otras entrevistas también encontramos que aparte de que muchas mujeres cabezas de familia trabajadoras del campo tuvieron que dejar de trabajar porque las escuelas las cerraron.
In the survey too, we found many farm worker women had to stop working because school closures and had to take care of their children.
Ellas se quedaron ya a cargo de sus hijos, pero ellas enfrentaron una dificultad grande porque ellos, muchos de sus hogares no contaban con las redes sociales, con el Wi-Fi para poder sus hijos tener sus clases en casa.
Many of them stayed home to help their children with school, virtual school, but many of the households didn't have access to Wi-Fi or internet.
Muchas personas muchas de estas familias tuvieron que adquirir ese servicio y obtener un gasto más para la familia, aún ellos ya habiendo perdido su trabajo.
So many of them had to acquire this new service and pay for the service even though they had been losing wages.
Y muchas de ellas, no sabiendo la tecnología, era una barrera grande poder apoyar a sus hijos para que ellos pudieran entrar a sus clases y recibir ahí la escuela en casa.
And many of them didn't know how to navigate for the virtual school, so they weren't really able to help their children with online schooling. This created a major challenge. Gracias, Sandra. Bueno, vamos a la siguiente pregunta, so we'll move on to the next question. You know, this conference is all about connecting theory to practice. So I want to pose this question: what kind of knowledge was necessary to launch the Oregon COVID-19 farm worker study? And how can we extend our conception of respective knowledge to involve different forms of knowledge? And how do we mobilize these knowledge systems in practice through collaboration? So Lynn, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think there's one last slide. What I want to talk a little bit about is the kind of knowledge that's usually invisible in studies, because we come in with ideas of objectivity, and we're not letting the knowledge systems of the folks who are interlocutors drive what we're looking at. I think we're going to talk more about that. But part of the process here in having this collaboration is recognizing the real experts are not me or the PhD, but the folks in the community, that they are experts. They know what the concepts are, they know what the issues are, and they know the kinds of questions that need to be asked to get folks to, kind of share what's going on here. So one example I just wanted to give is like the invisible labor of care. Like this has been a big theme in a lot of studies of COVID-19. But this really was, when we began to look at this, very important, not only for looking at the kind of suffering that people were going through, but what are the resources that they brought? What is already in the room that makes a real difference, right? Because we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We just have to look around and see, what do we already have? What do folks bring to the table? So this is a slide about remittances and care work. And as I mentioned, all these communities are connected to people and family members, kin, in a lot of different places, right? So often when we look at them as quote workers, we're missing, 80% of what is going on in people's lives. So care work and the kind of care work, and this isn't care work that just started in the pandemic. It's care work, connections, ideas, and solutions that have been around for a long time. They're just not legible if you focus on labor, right, a worker. So, for example, even looking economically, many people were not able to send remittances, economic remittances, because they lost their work. They had to pay for more internet and other things. But that's not the only thing that people do. They call, they WhatsApp, they FaceTime. They're very, very connected to people every day. And even, I remember, some of the folks who I spoke with said, I couldn't offer money, but I called my parents every day. I talked to them. I talked with my sisters. We talked about, people didn't have money for medicine. We talked about herbal remedies, that could be used, right? Sharing that kind of knowledge that's already there. And as my colleague Sandra was saying, a lot of people, a lot of women and men were really afraid about being sick. They were home, sick, taking care of other people when they could barely, get out of bed, taking care of children or taking care of each other. And one of the things that just struck me was people had incredible strategies, right? Many people registered, what we would call mental health challenges. Most people did not have access to formal mental health support, as is the case for many people in the pandemic. It was still very difficult to access, not in their own language, not in their own terms, but people came up with other kinds of solutions. Limpias, a kind of cleansing. Some of the women I talked with, they talked about walking, singing, dancing, cooking, like all of these ways to try to create connection in this, when you weren't supposed to go out of your house, or getting out in nature, taking their families hiking, going to a park. I mean, just doing these things to feel better and doing them as a family collectively. And Finally, I think one of the things that's most amazing that was, I found in a set of interviews I did with some mom folks from Huehuetenango, from San Sebastian, Huehuetenango, and some other places who are in and around Woodburn and Salem, was they created a new and their own support organization. Even when people lost work, their wages were cut, they still were forming a sort of collective pot of money to help people, someone who was in an accident, someone who was really sick, someone who died, and it costs a lot of money, as we heard from our colleague Jorge, to get to get the remains of someone back, loved one back to Guatemala or wherever it is. So the pandemic sort of reveals these kinds of knowledges, systems, and ways of thinking that was so important. And that was an important sort of way of moving forward with our research.
Thank you, Lynn. How about Gabriela?
Yes, so I think that I will start with very similar words that my colleague Lynn used. I think that one of the great achievements of the CROFS has been the awareness that it has raised across the state, across government agencies, community-based organizations, entities like libraries, and healthcare settings, who are now very interested in learning about the linguistic diversity of farm workers and other communities actually across Oregon. But they rely heavily on us academic researchers, whereas as Lynn was saying, the knowledge, the understanding, the expertise about how to navigate this linguistic diversity that we're talking about, it's the language community members who have that expertise, not us with PhDs. We know how to use tools such as peer-reviewed papers and grammars and tools online designed for linguists to get a good grasp on the linguistic diversity, that it's the linguistic community members who know, who they understand, and who they don't understand. And so it is really important to know that it would be infinitely better to build relationships of trust with these individuals, these community members, so that there can be a good ground for talking about what languages they use and what languages they understand, especially in cases where an interpreter is needed, for example. Someone who, in addition to the CROFS project, I've been working a lot with education settings with the Oregon Department of Education, and one big challenge is that schools can't easily ask a family, a parent, what language they use at home, because there's any number that can constitute a trigger for a number of reasons, whether the family is in the U.S. as asylum seekers, or maybe they have been marginalized and discriminated against. Sometimes the children have been bullied for speaking an indigenous language, so the family is not likely to reveal what language they speak. So it's a matter of trust, and building that trust will open the pathway to reaching that understanding, that very expert firsthand understanding of how to navigate the linguistic diversity that we're talking about.
Thank you, Laurie, and I think that applies to other public provisions as well, building that trust. ¿Qué tal, Jorge o Valentin, if you want to contribute to that question?
Yeah, I'll be very brief. I was introduced to community-based participatory research back in 2004. We conducted a multi-year pesticide study with farm workers, including indigenous farm workers. And so in my involvement in that research has always been about from the beginning being engaged in the entire process of the research, from developing the instrument to analyzing and reporting back. And so yeah, I think that we had a similar approach with this research study. We engaged the community, and I think that when we do qualitative, data gathering, it gives space for a community that hasn't had the opportunity to lift other voices because of the system that we have, to get a chance to really express their lived experiences in these open-ended surveys, and also in the interviews that we did. I think it really elevates those lived experiences. And so some of the best recommendations that we received when it comes to policymaking, it came in one of our questions that we asked at the end. So if we had an opportunity to see with decision makers and government entities, what would you tell them? One of the interviewees, one of the workers I interviewed said, well, we have a large, farm population that has no immigration status. There isn't resources available to us. We can't go and apply for an employment benefit. We need these type of resources. Another indigenous farmer said, well, if I had the opportunity to speak with them, I would tell them we need to allocate resources so that government agencies and community-based organizations can produce culturally and linguistically appropriate educational materials in these indigenous languages. And so I think that, when we have the opportunity to really create a meaningful space for people to share their lived experiences, I think we can be very creative.
Okay, we'll go on to the next question. I think that's really important. Lived experience and positioning the folks that you interview as experts is something that really made this study have an impact that it did. What role, so for the next question, what is the role of trust and reciprocity? We've heard this a little bit, but we'll ask a little more. So what is the role of trust and reciprocity when engaging with farm worker communities in research or direct service? And so Valentin, do you want to respond to that first?
Yes, I think the trust is everything. I failed to mention that I did identify as Mixteco, speak an indigenous language. And, there's so many different challenges that impedes farmworkers in accessing resources and representations. And one of them, it has to do with immigration status. The other one has to do with retaliation. So there are many, many different challenges that they face. And so I think that when you build that trust with the community that you're working with, it really elevates the research study. I think the research study becomes more reliable and valuable, because when the community knows who you are as a researcher, there's that confidence. They feel confident that their story is going to be shared and elevated and valued and taken into account in decision-making processes. And you speak their language, their native language, and they have an opportunity to speak with you in their native language, it changes the dynamics, it changes the interview, it changes the quality of the data that we're gathering. And so I think that trust is key. And so when we take this non-traditional approach to research study, it really takes into account, that we value the community that we're serving, that we're going to go back and do the reporting back, sharing our findings with the community, because unfortunately, some communities have never seen the research when they have gathered data and they don't know what happened with the data, how it was utilized, what they found. And so it is really important, trust is important, sharing information and reporting back to the community is also critical in closing the cycle.
Excellent, thank you, Valentin. How about Lynn?
Yeah, I think we already talked about really questioning our knowledge models and really opening that up. And I think what Valentin was talking about is also about, what's often called research design, right? So rethinking what exactly does that mean to, rather than design, sort of invite to the table key stakeholders who are experts, who in conversation will begin to identify the questions that matter to the communities that are, represented in the study. And then how do you in fact engage with those community members in a way that relies on trust? And then how do you return that information in a way that maybe matters to the communities? Because of course, doing policy work, testifying with the legislature or political folks is a very different process. The way you're gonna, the kind of quote product or the form that you're gonna do that in, maybe testimony is different than a podcast in Spanish or Mixtec that's gonna be, listened to locally. So I think it sort of opens up the way we think about research design. The other thing I think that's super important out of this model is a commitment that everyone is a researcher, everyone is an expert. If it requires training, everyone gets the training that they need, so they're empowered and come away with new knowledge, not just as someone who facilitates research, but someone who is a researcher and learns how to do this and then brings that into their own organization. That's a skill. I teach graduate students how to do that. I teach classes on that, but these are, it's not a mysterious kind of skill. Right? It's how do you think of a question? How do you have a conversation? How do you capture that? And then how do you think about it? And anyone is capable of doing that. So everyone, sort of being a researcher and building the project from the bottom up and being ready for debate, difference. We debated, I think we had, I don't remember how many questions ultimately our survey of 300 people had. It was like 100, maybe. It was a lot. And we debated those questions over many months. We piloted them and had people say, promotores of people doing it saying, this question really doesn't work. So debating it again. So being willing to take the time to have those debates and those processes. I often think of it like in many indigenous communities in Mexico and Guatemala, where you have indigenous forms of government and you have asambleas or assemblies, they can last for like 6 hours or 8 hours, right? Till everyone has spoken and expressed their point of view. So are you willing to do that inside of the research project? And then I think for people like myself and Gabriela and Dr. Martinez, it also is a commitment to going back again and again and again and again and again and again and building relationships with, first specifically with organizations through time, and being responsive when something is needed that probably might not be on your plate today or your research agenda, but really considering that to be a kind of sacred kind of relationship of trust, because I think that's the only way that you can do this kind of research through time. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. And yes, it's a continuous conversation, right? So Oregon, we're not collecting data right now, but we're still in conversation in many ways, and the work continues. And so there's no clear ending spot for this type of work, which doesn't really align with the tenure track process or timeline, right? So kind of thinking of those different odds. But how about Laurie?
I just wanted to add a little bit, kind of being one of the community-based organizations involved in this study. And I think we really appreciated the researchers kind of supporting our involvement. And I think that the reason that, as Valentin said, trust is central. And I think part of the reasons the involvement of the community-based organizations were so amazing in building that trust is, one, there are community-based organizations based in local communities all across the state: Medford, McMinnville, Woodburn, Hermiston. And these organizations, most of them had decades of experience being rooted in their communities. And not just the organizations, but their staff that were working in these organizations had years of experience. And the staff most of them had lived experiences, meaning they were farm workers themselves. They came from farm worker families. They had lived and worked in farm worker communities. And I think the other piece that really helped is many of those organizations provided direct services, meaning they provided something tangible to their community. They provided food, clothing, legal services, access to rental assistance, housing, that helped to create that kind of real, firm, trusting relationships. And I think the other thing that these organizations do is they don't kind of just send an invite, hey, does somebody want to be part of a study? It's you go to workers and you make it convenient for them, right? You're going to talk to them at 8 o'clock at night. If that's the best time for them to talk, or you're going to talk it Saturday. And sometimes you might need to talk to them 3 times because their baby started crying halfway through the interview. And the interviewers, including folks on this table, were willing to do that to be sure that they heard the worker stories.
And just to add to that, receiving enough grant funding to pay community organizations or promotoras for their time, that's critical. And just to wrap up here, in case anyone else wants to add to this question, I'm going to move on. Final question. What are the strategies public servants can implement in addition to knowledge systems in the way we perceive knowledge to better serve farm workers effectively and adequately? And so how about Laurie? We'll start with you again.
Okay. And I think some of this is clear from what we've already said, but I would encourage folks to first obviously include farm workers in the conversations about different policies in your communities, and not just asking them about what barriers they face, but as people were mentioning, kind of what are the solutions that they suggest. And I think that once again, that hearing farm worker opinions means actually kind of going to them, maybe holding focus groups in trusted spaces that are near their homes at times that are convenient to them. And as colleagues have been mentioning, it means not just holding maybe one conversation with a group of farm workers, but multiple, because there's so many distinct communities within the farm worker communities. And I think one of the things that we benefited from in the survey is using open-ended questions and asking them clarifying questions about what they mean and allowing them to bring kind of their full selves within the survey, right? That when you're talking to farm workers, it's not just from the perspective of being an essential worker, but it's their parents and community leaders and business owners and neighbors. And so allowing them to kind of express themselves as their full human beings in that process. And I would also encourage people when you're creating policies to form partnerships with community-based organizations. And I think in the pandemic, we saw excellent examples of how partnerships with community-based organizations helped really provide education to communities that are often underserved, and oftentimes that kind of communication of education is not just written materials or visuals, but it's actual human to human communication. I think many community-based organizations have been critical in actually helping to enroll people with programs. Oregon Health Authority has that wonderful program where community-based organizations are actually doing the enrollment. I think other agencies could do the same. And then finally, I think community-based organizations can actually play a critical role in providing that service. In the pandemic, Oregon Human Development Corporation provided rental assistance very quickly to farm worker families. And actually allowing community-based organizations to be part of providing that direct assistance, I think is one of the things that we've learned. And I just want to give a final shout out to Jenny, because I think one of the beautiful parts of this project was this process. The facilitation was excellent, and I think Jenny played a huge role of that. And so investing in skills of group facilitation that create kind of inclusion and integrity and safe spaces and human-centered spaces and multilingual spaces helps create really good things. Thank you for that, Laurie. How about Valentin?
I think just 2 things, I want to say. The first one is recognizing that we have an imbalanced system when it comes to protecting and serving farm workers. That's the number one thing. The second thing is that, farm workers oftentimes don't have the opportunity to share their lived experiences in decision-making processes. So we have to think about creative ways in which we can listen to the stories, understand the stories, and make decisions based on those stories that are being shared with us. I'm just thinking, for example, rulemaking processes, right? We only have certain days to provide public comments. They're provided in English, and mainly 8 to 5, 9 to 5 when farm workers are working, and especially during the harvest season where they're working many hours and long hours. And so I think we have to think about how can we create channels of opportunities where we can lift up their voices and listen to these concerns before making any decisions that it will impact their living and working conditions.
For us, one of the biggest things was listening and taking the next steps to helping families. And so one of the things that we learned is that most of the families are interested in becoming self-sufficient. And so, we started bringing in classes in Zapoteco and Mixteco to our sites because families were interested in teaching their kids their native language or their dialect. The other thing is that families were also interested in budgeting and savings. One of the things that they learned from the pandemic is that they didn't have a clue or a better understanding on budgeting. And so we started bringing in resources as well as classes in Spanish to families on how to budget and how to start a savings account. And so, and then the other big part here was technology. Families realized that they were behind on technology. And so we brought in computer classes for our families. We also brought in experts, teachers that could teach families how to navigate the internet. Surprisingly, most of the families didn't know, most of the parents didn't know that they had an Amazon account because their kids were managing that account. They were making purchases. And so, later on, families were going back to the bank and saying, hey, there's a charge that it's not mine. And so, well, it is yours because the kid uses it to get the account. And so, it's been a learning process for all of us, but at the same time, we're listening to the needs of the families and we're taking actions to help them become self-sufficient.
Thank you. So many barriers, yet farm workers are finding ways to return to their autonomous ways, be autonomous, be able to self-govern themselves in their communities. Sandra, ¿quieres agregar?
Lo que quiero agregar para esto es que los trabajadores agrícolas se demandan una mejor calidad de vida.
What I want to add is that farm workers deserve a quality of life.
Siempre que los servidores públicos puedan revisar periódicamente los niveles de trabajo y lugares de vivienda.
Anytime government administrators can review work conditions and housing.
No olvidamos de ellos porque ellos son los que ponen nuestra comida sobre la mesa.
We can't forget about farm workers because they're the ones that provide food to our people.
Que darles un mejor salario también.
And they also need a better salary, wages. Yeah. Gabriela, I think you're going to close us out here. Thank you so much for meeting with us.
I think Sandra's words, I would have preferred if her words had been the closing words. I'm going to just point out the importance of not assuming who someone is and who they are culturally, what languages they use, whether spoken or sung, to not assume just because of the place they come or the last name they have. But rather, again, as we've heard, build a relationship of trust so that you can get to know that person and understand what is the best way to have a dialogue with that person. I wanted to just put this example and present this example to you all when, you know, right now we can say that we're speaking English, right? We don't say we're speaking Germanic. Germanic is the category that linguists use to lump up English and Frisian and Dutch and German and Norwegian and Swedish. And if I were to say I need an interpreter of Germanic, if I'm an English speaker, would a speaker of Frisian be the person I would understand? No. So why do we do that to Indigenous people? So again, it's a matter of trust. It's a matter of being willing to get out of our comfort zone, realize that maybe we have a bias, maybe there's an element of ignorance on our end, and be okay with that, and be okay with the fact that a farm worker, an Indigenous person, can teach us a great deal. So if we are open to that, then I think we will be on the way to build trust, to understand who someone is, to understand that we owe them a life of dignity, especially when they're serving, and they're providing such an important service to us, which is to bring food to our food.
Well, with that, thank you so much for being here today. So we're over time, but if you have any questions, now is the time. Okay. Questions or comments? All right, well, thank you so much. I will stick around